Welcome to Europe from Poverty to Prosperity. This is week 4. Your readings and I have referred to all kinds of new innovations occurring in Europe, in the United States. Scientific ones, as evidenced by the scientific revolution. Ideas that were political, economic, and social, as discussed during the Enlightenment era. Democratic revolutions, some of which were quite peaceful, like the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in Great Britain and the Act of Settlement there in the early 1700s. Transportation innovations, particularly those that were literally propelled by steam and the steam engine. Industrialization, as we looked at in proto-industrialization and the first industrial revolution, which occurred in Great Britain and then spread throughout the continent into places like the United States. So we discussed older, ancient, and medieval and early modern civilizations and talked about how nearly everyone was poor. 90% or more of the people generally were poor. They didn't necessarily know they were poor, right? Because they were living on an edge of existence in a kind of subsistence agricultural framework where there wasn't much trade actually happening between places. And how all of these things, scientific innovations, technological inventions, Enlightenment ideas, democracy, industrialization, capitalism, etc., give a whole new viewpoint, a new point of view, right, to the world, and leads to a new idea of progress. The idea that civilization and all of its parts, whether they be political, economic, social, or cultural, could progress, could advance in knowledge and in understanding, and this old idea of scarcity could go by the wayside as more and more people began to think that the world might be able to continually progress. Now, many of you are not history majors. In fact, the vast majority of you are not history majors, but you're taking this course maybe to fulfill your 120 credits to graduate, and because you have somewhat of an interest in this topic. And so we're going to put everybody on an even playing field. And first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about what is happening in the 19th century in Europe. Really what we see is the building of nations, literally nationalism in Europe in the 19th century. And you might say, well, but what does that mean? Well, what that means is this. If we would look at a map of Europe today and say, gee, there's Germany, and there's Italy, and there's Greece, and there's Belgium, that's something we could not have been able to do during the 19th century necessarily, because those places, even though they had languages associated with them, maybe ancient medieval components of them were in place, nevertheless, as we know them, they did not exist as nations in the sense that we know them until the 19th century. For instance, Greece was controlled by the Islamic Ottoman Empire, whose center was really in what we now call Turkey. But the Ottoman Empire, like the Roman Empire and other empires before it, was experiencing by the 19th century internal weaknesses and external strengths outside of it. So it literally became what some people call the sick man of Europe, which really did occasion an opportunity for the people of Greece to fight for 8 years between 1821 and 1829 for their independence. So by 1829, Greece, as we kind of know it today, emerges on the map of Europe. Napoleon fought these long wars named after him that were ended by the Congress of Berlin in 1815. And at that Congress, by the peace terms of that Congress, one of the many peace terms was that Belgium was for a short time united with the Netherlands into their own single nation state. The Belgians didn't necessarily like that, obviously, and rebelled in 1830, and so their independence was recognized. So clearly, we have Belgium and Netherlands assuming by about 1830 their basic kind of outlines that we would see on a map today. Italy was composed, as we'll see here in a minute in a map, of many different parts as well, and those were really unified under Cavour, the Prime Minister of Piedmont, by 1861 when the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed. And perhaps most importantly for our discussion here in this class, Europe from Poverty to Prosperity, are going to be the social welfare legislative efforts on the part of Otto von Bismarck, Prime Minister of Prussia. So if we were to look in the early 19th century at a map of Europe, we wouldn't really see a Germany, because Germany was composed of many different parts. Those were largely unified through 3 wars, and behind all of that was Prime Minister of Prussia, not Russia, but Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, Prussia was in northern Germany. And Bismarck was an adherent of Realpolitik, which literally means real politics, a pragmatic political philosophy where the end justified the means. The last time in our lecture 3 we spoke of Jeremy Bentham and of his disciple or student, John Stuart Mill, and of the whole idea of utilitarianism, the greatest happiness for the largest number of people, for the greatest good. And so you see this practical philosophy, this pragmatism, this utilitarianism, this Realpolitik, call it whatever you want depending upon what kind of thing we're looking at, economic or political, and you end up seeing that really what the 19th century is about an effort to discover what is going to work, and what is going to work in a world that is rapidly changing and rapidly globalizing, and really can be kind of upsetting and disruptive to the forces that used to be in place before that. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, Bismarck declared the German Empire. This was the Second German Reich. The first German Reich, literally empire, kingdom, was the Holy Roman Empire, which we've made references to before. The Second German Reich was that of Otto von Bismarck, Prime Minister of Prussia. The Third Reich, we know all too well, unfortunately, is Hitler's Third Reich of Nazism and of World War II. So these are maps showing you in the different colorations and the dates how literally Germany came together in the late 19th century, as well as Italy, and how those two become the countries that we really know them of later years. So we've discussed a little bit of the politics. Now we need to discuss a little bit of the technological innovations that were occurring. And we've already discussed in the prior lecture, in Lecture 3, about the First Industrial Revolution, which began in Great Britain and spread from there. But the Second Industrial Revolution was of a later time period, and it was the mid to late 19th century, and it lasted to the early 20th century. Some people, in fact, would say that we're in the kind of Third Industrial Revolution, which really is a digital revolution. But let's look at the Second Industrial Revolution. Just as the First Industrial Revolution was based upon 2 primary things, I said. One was the steam engine, and the second thing was iron production. So this Second Industrial Revolution is based upon several things. One is oil, rather than, coal and steam, but oil. Steel, which is a step up from iron ore production. Obviously, humans had been making steel for generations, for centuries, as evidenced, say, for instance, in Japan, where people were making steel swords for generations. But the process of making steel was, taking iron and literally purifying it and pounding away at it and folding and pounding and folding and pounding and heating and reheating and cooling down. And it was a very laborious process. It was a very labor-intensive process. And along comes new innovations like the Bessemer process to make steel that will enable iron ore to be made into steel rapidly and in great quantities. And of course, that is always, rapidly and in great quantities is always really the definition of progress in any industrialization. And then chemistry itself, new chemicals, and for instance, the making of rubber tires by Charles Goodyear and others, taking chemicals, combining chemicals, coming up with new compounds are also hallmarks of the Second Industrial Revolution. The U.S., of course, with people like the inventor Thomas Edison, really led the Second Industrial Revolution with such inventions as listed here, and there are many of them: air brake, telephone, incandescent electric light bulb, sewing machine, cash register, phonograph, film camera, motion picture camera, all-electric starting motion, and of course the first manned heavier-than-air flight by the Wright brothers. Now, you can see what happens here is also going to be innovation in transportation. So it would take normally on a sailing ship, which obviously depended upon the wind, to make the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and the United States 1 to 3 months. When steamships were introduced, this was literally cut in less than half, much less than half, in a literally almost a third of the time. And that, by 1850, the record was 11 days and 8 hours. So too, the telegraph, and literally they laid a telegraph line along the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, and by 1866 connected the United States with Europe so that news could literally travel within minutes, hours between places, European capitals, and the United States. Now, while all this is happening, people were leaving the farms in Europe, moving to the cities, and sometimes leaving those cities on the new steamships to come to the United States, first sailing ships and then steamships. So between 1850 and 1920, more than 25 million immigrants came to the United States. Many of those would become the laborers for the new mills and factories of the United States. Remember, we talked in the last lecture about Lowell, Massachusetts, and how early on the cotton mills, the textile mills of Lowell, Massachusetts, had employed American farm girls. Well, that changes. By about 1855, more than 60% of the employees of the Lowell cotton mills were now Irish. And then these are very important statistics, and that is, by 1860, the U.S. ranked second to Great Britain in industrial production in the world. So that's on the eve of the American Civil War. 20 years later, by the early 1880s, the U.S. was number one. It had surpassed Britain in industrial production. There were also business and marketing innovations, so not just technology, but also marketing and business innovations. And one of those was really undertaken or pioneered by Andrew Carnegie, who was born in Scotland, and he immigrated to the United States at age 12. He would make his money in production of steel in the great corporation that he built called Carnegie Steel. Why, he was a philanthropic man, and he gave away some $300 million, mainly to the libraries, to what were called Carnegie Libraries throughout the United States. Nonetheless, he made his money really on the backs of the poor working class. His factory workers worked for low wages, 12-hour days, 6 days per week. One of the things he pioneered was vertical integration. That is, literally, where you would try to control everything in your operation that went from raw materials through manufacturing to transportation. So, for instance, he operated steel mills such as the one depicted here and the postcard to the right. So, these steel mills needed coal to fire the furnaces, and they also needed iron ore to make into steel. So, he began to acquire, to buy up coal mines and iron ore mines. Then he would take the coal and iron ore and use it to make steel in his steel mills, so there was a finished product here. Then he began to acquire shipping companies, like, for instance, in the Great Lakes, which would be able to transport the iron ore, much of it coming from the Great Lakes region, to his steel mills, and then once the finished product was ready, it could also then transport those to places to be sold. This is called literally vertical integration. Now, as opposed to that, there's horizontal integration, which is more or less what we think of when we think of monopolies. John D. Rockefeller was one of the pioneers of this horizontal integration, of the formation of trust and holding companies. So, for instance, he founded the Standard Oil Company, and by the 1890s, the Standard Oil Company controlled 90% of all oil and was the largest business enterprise in the world, literally an example of horizontal integration. Other examples of horizontal integration included what we now know as chain stores. So the first kind of discount stores were stores that generally sold items for 5 cents and 10 cents, hence they earned the name of five and dime stores. And they included places like F.W. Woolworth and S.S. Kresge. S.S. Kresge, by the way, grew into what we know today as Kmart. F.W. Woolworth became very popular worldwide, especially in Great Britain. This is also the time of the great department stores. And, of course, later on, those department stores would also branch out horizontally in terms of chain stores. So we have lots of things happening here. We have telegraphs and steamship service and transatlantic telegraphs and transcontinental railroads. And we have things like the Suez Canal opening in 1869, very important in order to literally connect that trade from India and the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, right into the Mediterranean. So literally connecting India and those places to the Far East, like China, with Europe, and in a more direct and quick route than having to go all the way around the coast of Africa. The last time we had introduced you to a world fair, to an exhibition, sometimes called expositions, and that was at the Crystal Palace, where we said Victorian peoples were very excited about the technology, the innovation, the progress being made, and they went to these fairs in order to see the latest inventions and to celebrate those. Those continued, and especially a number of them were held in the United States, for instance, to celebrate the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. There was one held in Philadelphia where the telephone was first exhibited. In 1901 at Buffalo, where the wireless, which was the predecessor of the radio, was exhibited. 3 years later, at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, the radio tube exhibited. The Panama Canal opening in 1914, and of course that was owned by the United States. That literally enabling trade to occur between the Pacific and the Atlantic without having to go all the way around the Cape in South America. And the Panama Pacific Exposition, which was celebrating the opening of that canal in San Francisco, was the first World Fair to make extensive use of motion pictures. So you can see how the 19th century and the early 20th centuries were tremendously successful in technology and industrialization and in literally helping to kind of shrink this world and to enable greater global trade to occur. Now, as all of that was happening, in terms of politics, in terms of technology, in terms of transportation, we also have to look at the monetary kind of policies, literally the availability of money, who printed money, who coined money, and how were they all kind of experimenting with this new global trade and with this new kind of worldwide production of goods and wealth. And one must say that it was all kind of experimental because no one ever had to deal with economies of this vast size before. Well, in 1821, it really all starts out when Great Britain adopted the gold specie standard. And what the gold standard literally meant. As you know, the Bank of England was literally the central bank of England. It would be the bank that, headed up the issuance of banknotes, that is, of paper money, and that supported those with gold reserves. It would also be the bank that would set the discount rate, that is, the interest rate at which they would loan out British pounds to other banks, to savings banks and to investment banks, etc., in Great Britain. So this idea of a central bank is vastly important and really taking the lead, because the lead of the investments, most were coming out of Great Britain during this time period. Taking the lead was Great Britain, which adopted in 1821 a gold standard. A gold standard literally meant that a country, a nation such as Great Britain, would have on reserve enough gold to cover every banknote, that is, all the paper money that had been issued and was out there in circulation, and all of the gold and silver and bronze and whatever coinage whatever it was made out of, in gold. So there was literally a reserve to cover the cost of that paper and other money. So it was theoretically possible for anyone in Britain to say, here are my British pounds, put them down, and I want the equivalent in gold bars and gold back, to have that balance in place. This might be a good time for you to review my bimetallic monetary system entry from the World History Encyclopedia, but I'll discuss just a little bit about that to help you understand. Now, the United States was different because it had a bimetallic monetary system. So literally, if you wanted to, you could take your coins or your paper money, take it to the U.S. Mint, and ask them to convert it into either gold or silver, and they would be, in fact, required to do that. Needless to say, we don't do that anymore. Our system is too big to actually enable that to happen. We're not on a gold standard anymore. Anyhow, in 1849, there was this huge gold rush in the United States as they discovered all kinds of gold in places like California. And so more and more gold was coming into the marketplace. And when you have a glut of gold, for instance, then what is going to happen is its value is going to go down. So gold was not worth as much as it used to be. However, if you had gold, you could literally bring it to the U.S. Mint, where there was already an established ratio, and you could exchange it for silver, which, and this just is meaning you're converting one thing, gold, into silver, etc., and then you can go out on the marketplace and do and exchange that and sell that. In the end, a law called Gresham's Law actually comes into play. And that means that the overvalued coinage at the mint, gold in this case, because it's overvalued at the mint, it's not overvalued in the marketplace. It's overvalued at the mint. tends to drive the undervalued coinage, in this case silver, out of general circulation. If you don't completely understand that, that's fine. Just take my word for it. I do not lie. Between 1849 and 1873, this is exactly what happened. Gold, there was a glut of gold. Silver, which was the undervalued coinage, was driven out of general circulation. In fact, no one, not a single person, from 1849 to 1873 brought any silver to the mint to exchange it for gold. Now, because that is happening, and silver is really not in general circulation, and this was happening worldwide, Prussia in 1871 just stopped the minting of silver gold coins. I mean, what's the purpose of it? There's not enough of it in general circulation. There's plenty of gold in circulation, so just do gold coins. In 1873, the U.S. did something kind of similar, but not completely. It stopped unlimited coinage of silver. However, legislation in that regard was reversed in 1878 and in 1890. The first Great Depression occurred right after this 1873 Fourth Coinage Act, and some blamed the 1873 Depression in the United States on that Coinage Act. But we know that it was a bigger panic, a bigger depression than just the United States. It enveloped all of Europe. And in fact, for over 20 years, Europe and the United States really went into a long recession. In Great Britain, they called it the Long Depression. And some scholars refer to this, since the 1929 Great Depression, as the first Great Depression. Obviously, at the time, they just called it the Great Depression, but then we got another Great Depression, so now we need to call it the First Great Depression. The panic actually began in 1873 in Vienna, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was one of the places that was the centerpiece of investment banking. There were many causes for it, including overspeculation in railroads. Whenever anybody overspeculates in anything, stocks, as we'll find out, or railroads, finally the bubble burst. Now, this gets us to a very important point, because we've discussed the political environment of the time, we've discussed technological innovations, transportation innovations, and of course we've discussed a little bit about horizontal vertical integration, the growth of monopolies, and also this whole monetary system that was growing up and people were experimenting with, and gold standards and the like. And we're going to go back. We're always going back to what we introduced early on in the class, and we will continue to talk about again and again and again. And I'm showing you here in this almost spectrum of the undeserving poor, the deserving poor, and we know who these people included. We know who these people included. But very oftentimes, these were the people that the whole economic system begins to center and focus on. For years and years, no one really paid attention to them, and one might even argue that today we generally don't pay attention to them. Instead, we worry about those people who are taking advantage of social welfare systems, and those people who really are deserving of some sort of social welfare because they can't change their circumstances. But so oftentimes we forget about this large component of the working poor, those people that literally were one paycheck away from disaster, or one work accident away from disaster, one death of a breadwinner away from disaster, one recession or panic or depression or whatever you want to call it away from disaster. And so it is not surprising that especially in the mid to late 19th century, we will see a few different solutions being thought up to help the working poor. One of those is labor unions. And so if we were going to look at this as going from the more conservative to the more liberal and kind of in between, middle of the road, we would say that the more conservative solutions would have been labor unions, although they were highly controversial at the time. And many of them, especially in the United States, thought of labor unions as a restraint of trade, as literally against the Constitution. Then there were the social welfare, which you can read about in all of your readings, mechanisms and programs that Germany brought about, essentially to buy off this working poor class and to keep them happy. And then the more leftist-oriented, the more radical or liberal solutions is evidenced by socialism and socialist programs. So first of all, let's define this liberalism of the 19th century. And we have to be very careful not to define liberalism of the 19th century in the way that we tend to define liberals in the United States in the 21st century. Liberals and conservatives in 21st century United States mean something totally different than liberalism in the 19th century. Liberalism in the 19th century did not have any really bad negative connotations as it does today sometimes. Liberalism really just meant the belief in liberties, the belief in freedom. One of the very important historians, Robert Strayer, expresses it best in this long quote, but I think it's worthwhile. He says, the term liberalism, quote, the term liberalism has assumed so many different meanings that it defies clear definition. In the early 19th century, however, liberalism had definite meaning and aims. A liberal was a person who believed in freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom from economic restrictions, freedom of trade, and freedom from the political injustices of the old regime. Most of these freedoms, he said, had already been demanded by the leaders of the Enlightenment. The philosophes held that every man had certain natural rights, life, liberty, and property. These rights the middle class had already demanded before and during the French Revolution, and it continued to demand them. But as time went on, its claims were not based on natural law, as they had been during the 18th century, but on the grounds that they were the most sensible and useful way of bringing about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. This attitude of applying utility to political and social institutions is called utilitarianism, end quote. Pragmatism, practical solutions, utilitarianism, call it realpolitik, call it what you want it. But all of it was engaged in the idea that people needed to be free. They needed to be free to think and worship and trade and enter whatever profession that they wanted to do. So liberalism, a liberal and a believer in liberalism in the 19th century would have been a believer in social progress. Liberalism also in that time period took on another kind of thought pattern, and that was anarchism, literally a stateless society. Now, this does not mean that an anarchy meant, a violent bringing about of an anarchy in which people would assassinate one another like they did, American president in the late 19th century. But what it did mean is that if civilization was progressing, the old ideas of Enlightenment figures like Thomas Hobbes, that government was like a leviathan, literally a monster. A monster. Government was a monster. And the reason why we needed that monster is because people were selfish. People would kill one another unless we had government. What the liberals were saying, adherents of liberalism were saying, is that we should be progressing culturally, socially, economically, politically in such a way that we want to be selfless. We want other people to partake of prosperity. We want peace. We want justice. We want freedom. And we don't need a government necessarily to legislate it and to force it down people's throats. So here comes a big, big, big difference between what capitalism and everybody discusses about every economic situation in the world, whether it be manorialism, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, whether we're talking about the communalism of China and Japan versus the individualism of the United States, it all comes down to this. We are constantly in our societies, no matter where we were and under where we are and under what kind of economic system we operate, we are struggling in this balance, this almost harmony between communalism, in which we recognize that we all have to work with one another and for one another for the common good, the commonwealth of our nation, versus the fact that we have individual rights and individual freedoms and ought to be able to pursue what we like individually. Liberalism looks at all of this and says, yes, we believe in individual freedoms. But if individual freedoms run amok and everybody just does whatever they want, then all of society, all of civilization, the political and the economic components will all fall apart. We have to balance our sense of duty to others with our sense of duty to self. And how we do this is not to be forced to do it, but we do it in voluntary organizations that allow us to do it because we want to do it. How else would freedom happen unless you wanted to do it? So many utopian socialist communities were being formed at this time. And they were, we call them utopian socialism because it's like utopian. It's almost idealistic. It seems to go against the grain of pragmatism. But in their time period, I think that they probably would disagree with the idea of utopian socialism as being idealistic. They would have seen it as being pragmatic, as being practical. Many of these communities, by the way, were known for their feminism, for their inclusion of women in all different roles of leadership. An example of a utopian socialist community would have been the Shakers, or the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Coming in the United States. There was a Shaker community in western Cincinnati and Harrison, Ohio. There was one up in Dayton, Ohio, and many of you might have been to one at Pleasant Hill, Kentucky, outside of Lexington, Kentucky, which has been completely restored. The Shakers, like some of these utopian socialist communities, were a religious community. You volunteered to join them because you wanted to join them. And when you did, you gave up all of your property. And in a utopian socialist community, the property was owned in common. Everybody worked and everybody shared the products of that work, of the prosperity that it would produce. Another socialist of his time, utopian socialist, was the Frenchman Charles Fourier, who lived from 1772 to 1837. And he believed that people should join together in these communities called phalanxes. And a phalanx would literally be a community that sort of looked like this. This is actually New Harmony. We'll refer to that in a minute. Where there would be dormitory-like buildings. There would be apartments for people. And where mothers and fathers would raise their children till about age 3 or so. And then their children would move to another part of the dormitory to be raised with other children. They would attend school. And then this phalanx in this community, people would work, manufacture things. They would produce, they would have their own gardens and agriculture. It would be sort of a self-sustaining community. old people would be taken care of. You wouldn't necessarily have to cook on your own. There would be a common mess hall where you could get breakfast, lunch, dinner, etc. These were these ideal communities, Charles Fourier and Phalanxes. Another proponent of this was Claude Henri, Count of Saint-Simon. And believe it or not, there was a very important industrialist who owned mills in New Lanark, Scotland, and his name was Robert Owen. And Robert Owen was a very compassionate man, and he believed that you needed to treat workers fairly. And so he created this new community of New Lanark in Scotland, where the workers could be housed in good housing, where they had access to health care, where they had access to education, recreation, etc. He paid his workers a living wage. And he said, you know, this is all marvelous, this is all wonderful. He was a wealthy man. He said, but where I could really bring this into play in a major way would be in the United States, because the United States was like a new stage for world civilization. So he bought up one of these old utopian socialist communities owned by a religious group called the Rappites, along the Wabash River, where it came into the Ohio River, what is now really the border between Indiana and Illinois. So just downstream on the Ohio River, Wabash River's from Evansville, Indiana, and he formed a place called New Harmony, Indiana. This was his idea from his architect of what New Harmony, Indiana would be. It would be one of these phalanxes. Actually, this thing never got built. They did have a community. It just lasted for a few years. And then these old struggles between communalism and individualism kind of broke out, as did in many of these utopian socialist communities, and they just simply ended it. And he lost a lot of money, by the way, on New Harmony, Indiana. Well, there were other people arguing for literally not for revolutionary. So this is voluntary, this is evolutionary, this is not revolutionary utopian socialism. This is revolutionary. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels was a wealthy man in Great Britain who teams up with Karl Marx, and they co-authored the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And there they predicted that a class conflict would erupt between a lot of these new factory owners, these upper middle class bourgeoisie, and the landless. You know, they generally did not own their own land. They were renting. The proletariat, the workers, the landless workers that worked in these large enterprises and factories. And that this class conflict would ultimately destroy capitalism and a classless society would be formed. And of course, this might take place in an evolutionary way or revolutionary, but we know that it takes place in Russia and China in revolutionary ways. Liberalism then also meant other things. The democratization of society. For instance, steam press newspapers, which would bring news to all the different people so they could read about what their leaders were doing, and that this would democratize society. Steamboats, steamships, railroads, bringing people closer together, telegraphs, all would help democratize society and bring about individual and communal liberties. Liberal reform measures, like the repeal of the Test and Corporations Act in Great Britain, where Protestant dissenters, that is, those who were not members of the Church of England, were no longer barred from holding state offices. The Emancipation Bill of 1829 in Great Britain, where Catholics were permitted to sit in Parliament. The Reform Bill of 1832, we already talked about this, where more of the right to vote was given to adult males. So by about this time, 1 in 5 adult males in Great Britain could vote. By the Reform Bill of 1867, it gave the vote to urban workers, so the majority of adult workers by 1867 in Great Britain now had the right to vote, and it extended this to male farm workers in 1884. So all of these things are showing greater liberties, rights to vote, greater democracy. And there were even liberal revolutions, such as those which occurred in places like France in 1830 and 1848, and these were successful. And then a bunch of unsuccessful liberal revolutions, especially in 1848 in Italy and Austria and Hungary and Germany and Prussia. These were all quelled. They were all put down, and they were not successful, but nonetheless they evidenced the struggle of many people for gaining additional liberties. Liberal economic ideas, and we've already discussed things like Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and laissez-faire economics in Britain, and we've discussed the Whig Party and their support of free trade, getting rid of all these horrible tariffs and excise taxes in order to bring the economy, into greater liberty of trade. Trade unionism, as it was originally called, or what we now know as labor unions. These are seen as the rights of workers to negotiate with large owners of factories, etc. And liberalism also meant women's rights. And here you see Mary Wollstonecraft of Great Britain, who was a great women's rights leader, wrote an important work in 1792 called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Her daughter, by the way, was Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. British women worked for the abolition of the slave trade, and in 1833, Britain abolished slavery in the empire. Earlier on, it had abolished the slave trade. Later on, it went ahead and abolished slavery in the entire British Empire worldwide. And women in the United States worked for the cause of anti-slavery. And so in the United States, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott were working for the political rights of women. This is all liberalism. Married women were giving property rights in Great Britain in 1882. Australia became one of the first nations in the world to adopt women's suffrage. And then by 1920 in the U.S., women's suffrage, that is, the right to vote in federal elections. Now, there were time periods when anti-Semitism, which was trying to deprive Jewish people of their rights, actually kind of took the upper hand, or at least became prevalent in Europe, and led, by the way, to an interest among those who cared for the Jewish people or Jews themselves to finally establish their own homeland, which eventually would be Israel, to get away from the anti-Semitism, from the discriminatory pogroms and they were not pogroms, but pogroms of Russia, to get away from all other kinds of discrimination. Some Jews emigrated to places in the U.S. and to Western Europe to escape discrimination, to escape these horrible programs, etc. Now, Russia is one of the last places to really start industrializing, and in fact, by 1861, it was still a largely agricultural society and would remain so into the early 20th century. And the Tsar finally emancipated or freed the serfs in 1871. And we all know, I think, the story of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who took the pen name of Lenin, and how his whole idea of bringing socialism to Russia led to kind of a division between his followers called the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks believed that there had to be a bourgeois state of development to occur in Russia before the proletariat could revolt. I mean, basically, Russia was still an agricultural society. And so it really didn't have a proletariat. It had peasants. And Lenin said, no, we can go ahead and do this. We can go ahead and have a revolution. And in fact, that revolution does occur during the course of World War I. And it was called the October Revolution. And it ended up in a four-year civil war in Russia. and it ended up in the assassination of the Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family, and in the world's first large-scale socialist government. So this is going to be very important as we start looking at other things in the class. And the next time in our final lecture is going to be next week, week 5, in which we're going to talk about the Second Great Depression, which begins in 1929. Any questions, feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help.